Good evening and welcome everyone to the Veterans Breakfast Club. My name is Todd DiPastino. I am your host tonight for our Veterans Breakfast Club program. And with me is not Sean Hall, my colleague and fellow and friend here who works at the Veterans Breakfast Club, but rather Glenn Flickinger. Hello, Glenn. How are you?
Hello, Todd. Good to see you and glad to be on to try to help you as best I can.
So that will be your role. You'll be co-host. I'll be hosting it. And tonight we're talking about the Fall of Saigon, which occurred 50 years ago this week. Today is April 28th. So 50 years ago today, the last fixed wing aircraft left Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon, packed with human cargo, escaping the imminent fall of the city to the communist North Vietnamese army. The the airport Tan Son Nhut would come under attack on April 28th. And on April 29th, there would be no more fixed wing aircraft. Maybe the one left early in the morning. I'm not sure about that. Maybe Ben Wright can tell us about that. But on April 29th, the rotor ring evacuations began, Operation Frequent Wind, which evacuated thousands of South Vietnamese and thousands of Americans out of South Vietnam. And by April 30th, when the tank, the NVA tank, famously crashed through the Iron Gate of the presidential palace in Saigon, that meant that the Republic of Vietnam, the country of South Vietnam, the country that the United States had pledged to support since the 1950s, had fallen. It had been effectively removed from the roster of nations and would be integrated with the communist North, ending the Vietnam War and losing the Vietnam War from the American point of view. I mean, the whole American war was fought to preserve, protect, and defend the country, the independent, non-communist country of South Vietnam. And on April 30th, 1975, that effort was lost. And so we thought we would talk about this momentous event that occurred 50 years ago this week. I'd love to hear the stories, especially from those who served in Vietnam, who remember maybe, watching the news about the fall on April 30th, 1975. Also, of course, if we have anybody in the room who, young or old, were in Vietnam at the time and managed to escape, would love to hear your story, and others who were a part of the Vietnam War, and that this moment in history is something that you not only remember, but it hits you in a powerful way. Would love to hear your story. We're also really grateful to have Jay Veith with us. George J. Veith. I know I'm not looking quite at the gallery view here, but I know Jay is with us. I'm going to be calling on him to provide some historical context for the fall of Saigon. George, or Jay Veith, is a well-known historian. He's really one of the very few historians, strangely enough, who have focused on the Army of South Vietnam and the history of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. He's written several books about Vietnam, one being Black April, The Fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975. So we're going to be calling on you, Jay, to give us some historical background and context for this story. And then finally, we have a Marine Vietnam veteran, Ron Farina. It's a grim anniversary today. Ron lost a good friend of his on this day in 1967, April 28th, and he sent me a vivid and compelling story that just had me in tears as I was reading it here this morning at my computer. So I asked him if he would be willing and able to come on and talk about his friend Al Rose, who was killed this day, April 28th, 1967. So we have a lot to cover. And I thought we would start with the stories that are shared in VBC Magazine this month. Many of you got this in the mail this week. This is our latest issue of VBC Magazine. As you know, our magazine comes out every quarter. It's sent free of charge to almost 11,000 households. We're almost at 11,000 households. By the next issue, we will be there. 11,000 households. And then we print up another 7,500, it turns out, were delivered to my doorstep a few days ago. And over 5,000 of those are now out the door, sent in bulk to people around the country. So this is all to say, if you don't get our magazine, we'd love to send it to you. Just let us know your address. You could email me, Todd, Todd, at veteransbreakfastclub.org, and we'll make sure that we get it in the mail to you. But this issue is dedicated to the fall of Saigon, as you see, and also the fall of Kabul, which had a distinct echo from 1975. And in this issue, there are several veterans share their memories of the fall of Saigon, including Ben Wright, who was actually there on this day and flew one of the last flights, fixed wing C-130 flights out of Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon. So I thought we would start with Ben, ask him to share his memories of that day. Let me see here. Ben, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Thank you for joining us. Ben.
I got him.
You got him? All right. You're going to get him before I do. Jay Veith, I see you now. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. He doesn't know who the heck I am or who the heck we are, but and this is an important anniversary for him as a historian. So I'm deeply grateful that he joined us. All right. So, hey, Ben, how are you?
Well, doing great. Thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Does it seem like 50 years ago that you were flying people out of Saigon?
Well, time flies fast. What can I say?
Yeah. Do you remember it vividly?
Oh, very much so.
Was it something that you talked about much? I mean, you had a 22-year career in the Air Force. Was did this day, this episode stand out for you?
It did. There were, I think, two highlights in my 22 years that really stood out in my mind as I watched the world rapidly change. And the first one, of course, was the fall of South Vietnam. And the other one then was I was in Germany when the wall came down in Berlin. And in both cases, I watched the world change very rapidly.
When
And
did go ahead.
so it changed a lot when Vietnam fell. Our whole emphasis changed. I mean, we were still doing a lot of other airlift in the Pacific and flew a lot in Thailand. But after Vietnam fell, was whether if we were going to help the Cambodians or not, as Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were assaulting Phnom Penh. And eventually, the answer was no. And then after the fall of Cambodia, was the rapid drawdown out of Thailand, and the whole complexion of everything shifted in Southeast Asia.
Everything shifted, and everything shifted in your life, I imagine. Where
Sure.
were you stationed in April 1975?
I was flying out of Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The wing I was in had been actually on Taiwan, CCK, and as part of the 73 peace agreement, Nixon and Kissinger went to the one China policy. And so out of that, the wing moved from Taiwan to Clark. And I actually went into the wing about very shortly after it arrived at Clark Air Base in the Philippines.
The NVA, the final NVA offensive against South Vietnam began in early March, I think the first week of March 1975. Were you following it closely, the march of the North Vietnamese Army?
Oh, very much so. We were watching all the news reports, and they were tentative at first across the DMZ. They were waiting to see if the U.S. would respond or not. The U.S. didn't respond, and so they got bolder, more and more people, and then it was, kept going south. Da Nang fell, and all these pictures, and you had some in the magazine of just all these people going down Highway 1, heading south, trying to stay ahead of the North Vietnamese.
So you were anticipating, of course, that you would be called upon to start getting involved in evacuations.
Yeah, we, said at some time, that they're going to have to airlift all the Americans out of there because there were a lot in Saigon still with the embassy. And, of course, there were all the Vietnamese who worked for the Americans and the ARVN. And it became obvious very early on that South Vietnam was going to fall. And so, what our response would be we were just there waiting to see what it would be.
Now, of course, the United States had signed a treaty with North Vietnam in January 1973, extricating the U.S., removing the U.S. from Vietnam entirely. So American uh, combatant units were not active in Vietnam ever since March 1973. So there was some concern or some call for the U.S. to get back into the war to save South Vietnam in March and April 1975. Did you were from what you remember, were you and your fellow air crews kind of hoping that the U.S. would jump back in and save the country?
Well, at that point, it seemed like a lost cause. And we didn't expect, the current political climate that they would.
Right,
But of course, if the U.S. did respond, we would respond
right.
and do so with great enthusiasm. So there were, some efforts to get things out of Vietnam that we didn't want the North Vietnamese to have. And then, the maximum airlift really kind of started in April, first with the strategic air people, C-141, C-5s, after the C-5 flying the Baby lift, uh, that was very much publicized because it was the most disastrous military aircraft crash ever. No more C-5s went in. And then as the North Vietnamese got closer, the C-130s had a much smaller infrared signature than did the C-141, so they stopped the C-141s, and anything after that was C-130 airlift or, what the South Vietnamese Air Force had.
So when was your first flight into Vietnam in this period? Was it March to get fuel rods?
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know the U.S. built a nuclear reactor in Dalat. And I don't know what it was about the nuclear fuel that was in it, but there was a lot of concern that they wanted that nuclear fuel out of there, and they didn't want the North Vietnamese to have it. And so we actually lifted it out of there on Easter Sunday, 1975, which was the end of March.
Hmm.
And we took it to Ton Son, then it went on 141s and went on back to the States. But it was about 4 days, probably from about the 20, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, that time frame that we started the intensive airlift of refugees out of Ton Son.
How many flights did you make into Ton Son and out?
Yeah, I flew two on the refugees because the first part of that they had me on alert, and it was a State Department alert for somebody that they wanted to get out of the South. All we could do was speculate as to who that might be, but they lifted me off the alert, and then I went and flew the missions into Saigon, and the last one I actually flew on about noon in and out of Ton Son on the 28th.
How long of a flight was it from Clark to Ton Son?
I don't remember exactly. It's 3 hours,
Okay.
something like that.
Okay. So you
And, and back.
So when you arrived on the 28th to Ton Son, could you, again, I'm always you've known me long enough, Ben, that I betray my ignorance often with my questions. Was it the kind of situation where, you could look out your window and see, I don't know, fire coming your way or destruction on the ground or something like that?
Well, it was pretty quiet when we went in. We, of course, went in and did our intel brief, before we left Clark. And they told us as best they could where the North Vietnamese were and where they thought they had the 23 millimeter anti-aircraft guns and artillery, and where they had the SA-7 shoulder-fired Strela missiles that were heat-seeking infrared head missile. And so our goal was to stay away from them. And then while we were on the ground unloading refugees, an intel person would come up on the cockpit and tell us the latest information where they thought, to the best of their information, the North Vietnamese were. And of course, spiraling in and spiraling out. We tried to stay away from anywhere where the North Vietnamese were. There were some people that had a little bit of harassment fire, but that night, then they decided to close it down and actually attacked Tan Son Nhut, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that.
I'm going to share a picture. This is you, I think, with maybe flight training
Yeah,
graduate.
that was in when I was in pilot training. That photo would have been taken about July of 1970.
Okay, all right. July 1970, that would be 55 years ago,
Yes, sir.
coming up. And this is a C-130, the kind of airplane that you flew into Tan Son Nhut.
That's correct.
And one of the virtues of this plane, you said, is that it has a smaller signature.
Yeah, the turbo prop engines had a smaller infrared signature than the turbojets on the C-141s.
And I imagine that it was more maneuverable. In other words, you could do steep descents and steep ascents with it.
Yeah, we could probably descend faster than 141. We couldn't climb faster than 141 because they had a whole lot more thrust to weight ratio than we did
Okay.
in the 130s. But we would come in over the airfield about 10,000 feet where we thought we were, safe above where they were, and then we'd do as rapid a descent as we could. In other words, we depressurized and opened the troop doors and actually put a person out each troop door with a very pistol, which is a flare pistol. And if they saw a flare on a missile, well, then they could fire the very pistol away from the aircraft because um, that would be a more intense heat than the engines and would track the missile away from the aircraft to the flare. But we didn't see any, and we put down the gear and flaps and pulled the engines back to idle. And when you do that, then you got the gear and flaps hanging, and you got the all four props are like four big barn doors, and you could make a very rapid controlled descent. And we would do what we call a random steep approach rather than a conventional uh, traffic pattern. And the goal was to just show up on final, of course, with clearance to land. And we would land, taxi in, shut down the two inboard engines to reduce the prop blast and jet blast, open the aft ramp and door, and do an engine run and unload. And the embassies had all the bus loads of people out there that they had cleared to go. They just put people on until no more people could get on. And we closed the aft ramp and door and taxied out. We'd start the other two inboard engines while we were taxiing out, and off we went. And we would do the same thing. We would do a spiraling climb. Of course, we couldn't climb as fast as we could descend, but we would climb back up to 10,000 feet and then head east to go to the Philippines. They were having us either go to back to Clark or into Cuby Point at Subic Bay. It's the Naval Air Station, and they had hastily put together huge refugee camps in both places. I went back into Clark, and all the people on board went to the refugee camp there. Then later, they were airlifted by 130s to Anderson at Guam, and from there they went commercial to the States.
And Ben, and this is a picture of what it kind of must have looked like in your
Right.
C-130. People just packed in there, as you say, sardine class. Did you hear them? Did you
Oh, yes,
interact with
they
them?
were there.
Okay.
For the most part, they were very quiet,
Hmm.
and they were just glad to get on board the aircraft, and they were glad they had the opportunity to leave because people there, in fact, wanted to leave for a variety of reasons. And, it's always interesting because there's that many stories of people's lives in the back. But, we didn't feel threatened at all at that point. Of course, that changed that night when the North Vietnamese decided to shut the place down. In fact, our wing lost an aircraft on a ramp on a 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when they opened fire. There was three of them on the ground. They had sent a squadron from Little Rock over, but they had just come and gone to crew estimates. There were only a couple of their crews that actually flew sorties in there before it all closed down. But from our sister squadron, one of the aircraft had a mortar go through the fuel cell in the right wing while they were taxiing to pick up passengers. And of course, then all the fuel would have just spilled out, erupted in flame. And so they just shut it down, left it on the taxiway burning, and uh, ran out and got on another aircraft from our sister squadron, and off they went. Just left it burning on the ramp.
Glenn, you have a question?
Well, there's a really intelligent question in the chat, a searching question. What was the normal capacity of the C-130? How many did you get on for those evacuation missions? And how did you have to stop people from getting on? How did you manage that?
Well, the ground crews were there, and of course the loadmasters. They'd put on as many as they could, and button up, with children and everything, and people bobbling around. It was hard to count. Like that last one, they said there were 220. A lot of people said there were 250. There were some interesting things going on. They were saying they wanted us to call and tell them how many people were out on board, but supposedly we never had more than 175. But people had up to 250 people.
And at
Normally,
some
you
point,
could.
would it have been dangerous? Would you have, too much weight at some point?
No, because people don't weigh that much. It's not like vehicles or weapons or something like that. And they weren't carrying. I mean, they got on with whatever they carry in their hands. That was it.
What a
And
brilliant question that you asked. I'm looking in the chat. You asked that question, Glenn.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got that mixed up.
Okay,
oh,
all
that's all
right.
right.
Yeah, What a,
But
what a, what
to
a
answer your
genius.
question, we could rig for 96 paratroopers maximum. The normal logistics load we were rigged for up to 65 passengers and three pallet positions for cargo and our luggage and those kinds of things. So we were, typically there would be about 65 people in the back at the most. And in this case, it was 220 to 250 in the back. And a lot of military people flown on 130, so they can imagine what it'd be like to be in the back with that many people.
We want to move on to Joe Boscia and ask him
Sure.
about his experiences. But before I see this comment in the chat by Beth Russell. Ben is amazing. I was lucky to sit next to him on the plane to and from the VBC New Orleans trip, and he told me everything that was going on with the aircraft as he flew. And I think Beth had some flight anxiety. And I just
Well,
have
we
to
got a
say,
little bit of turbulence, but it
we had a
really
little bit of
wasn't
turbulence, yeah.
wasn't
Um,
serious.
I'm going to embarrass Ben and just say Ben has been one of the most important role models and mentors to me in my life. Certainly with the Veterans Breakfast Club. Ben is a former board member of the Veterans Breakfast Club. He is the epitome of the selfless servant, and I'm sorry, maybe the servant leader, and and he's a remarkable person who has an impact on so many people as a minister and also as a veteran and just a citizen. So thank you, Ben, for joining us and sharing this story.
You're welcome. Thank you, Todd.
All right. I want to ask Joe Boscia. I know he's with us. He's actually the one who got us started with the idea of having um, Glenn, do you see
Uh,
Joe Boscia?
yeah, but I will start looking right now. We got 80 people here, Todd.
Yeah,
Have proven to be a very good, attractive topic. Let me
I know
find
Joe.
them.
Yeah, we'll find him. We'll find him. But I want to say Joe shared his story of his memory of the fall of Saigon in an email to me. And I shared it with Daria Summers, who's on this call, who's our managing editor of VBC Magazine. And it was Joe's email, his vivid kind of retelling of his memories of April 30th, 1975, long after he had returned from Vietnam. That really gave us the idea, we should ask for other memories like this and include it in the magazine. So I'm really grateful to Joe. Oh, there you are, Joe. How are you, Joe?
All right, thank you, Todd.
Yeah, I'm a little slower on the uptake than Sean Hall is. But thank you, Joe, for joining us, and thank you also for sharing your story that's in our magazine. I want to show people a picture of you. This would have been you in, I think, Germany.
Yeah, so that was in Germany when we had a display day for families.
And at this point, you were an infantry company commander,
Yes, uh-huh.
and that's how you expected. That's the role you expected to play in Vietnam, right?
That's what I was hoping for, and it didn't come out that way though.
It didn't come out that way. What did you do instead?
When I got my orders, which Sue and I expected to get, they cut my 3-year tour in Germany short to 2 years. And that wasn't unusual because we were very understrength. They had shipped so many people out. And when the orders came in, and I think it was in November, they said I was going to be an advisor. And I had to find out a little bit about exactly what that was because I had toyed with the idea of volunteering for the 173rd Airborne Brigade because I was airborne qualified.
Right.
But being newly married, I just figured I'd wait until I got my orders. And when the orders came, they included going to Special Warfare School at Bragg for a course for the sector MATA course, as they called it, which was for what would be a county government here. And we were a little 6-man team for a county government southwest of Da Nang.
And so I'm going to share a picture of your wedding day because so you were married when you went to Vietnam.
Yes, we got married in June of 1967. We actually had 2 marriages because what most people don't know, in Germany and other European countries, a church wedding is not legal, and you have to get married under the status of forces according to German law. And that meant having a civil ceremony, which took place on the 2nd of June. And then we had our church wedding, which is this wedding party there that you saw on the 17th. And both sets of parents were able to come to it. And it was great. It was a military wedding with a saber arch and everything.
What was the nature of your work in Vietnam? This is a picture of you with, I think, one of your advisees, right? Arvin?
Yes, this this is on the last 3 months when I was pulled out of the district to replace a captain at the province of Hoi An as a S5 advisor, and this was my counterpart in the S5 shop there, and I'm holding a present that they gave me in a party at when I was getting ready to leave. I don't know why I didn't unwrap it, but it turned out it was a buffalo horn ship with the rigging and everything. A beautiful memento, which I still have.
So you were an advisor to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and you were also an advisor to what were somewhat derisively, I think, called rough puffs, that is regional and popular forces. They were like more local and regional militia of South Vietnam. What was your assessment of them as soldiers?
Well, the PFs, which were the ones in the district when I got there, were very scantily trained, let's put it that way. They were armed with cast-off World War II weapons like M1 rifles, not even carbines, and the little Vietnamese hauling around an M1 rifle was something. And they served in 4 of our outposts along with a Marine cap unit, and they also served at the district level. They didn't do a whole lot in terms of operations, and I didn't have to work very much with them. But partway through my time in the district, the South Vietnamese government sent in a newly trained RF company, regional force company. This man over here to my right in the picture was the regional force commander. He was a lieutenant, had had a lot of combat experience going back many years. And his unit was pretty squared away. I went out on a number of operations with them. This is one of them. And they were pretty good soldiers because they had had some decent training. So there was a big difference between the PFs and the RFs, at least in our district.
And you spoke some more than rudimentary Vietnamese at the time, correct?
Yes.
So, and that's how you communicated, mainly through Vietnamese?
Yeah, that, and also the RF commander asked me if I would teach English to him and his officers. So I would go over there, I forget how often, and I would give them English lessons so that they could start to learn. And they wound up giving me some presents too. Um, on this particular operation, which was a rice denial operation, where we went out into no man's land to gather up the rice and take it back so the VC couldn't get it, we stopped in one village where people still lived, even though it was in no man's land. It had been bombed and by both sides. And we were eating out at a big table, all the officers and myself. And there was an old lady who had gotten us our food, and of course she was full of betel nut on her teeth and gums and everything. And I was eating away with chopsticks, and I like Vietnamese food. And she was at the other end of the table, and I saw her reach over and start to talk to the lieutenant, company commander, and she was looking at me and laughing about the fact that I was eating Vietnamese food and with chopsticks. So I looked at her, and from the other end of the table, I said to her in Vietnamese, and my pronunciation today is probably pretty awful, but I said, Tai Shao Kuito Ba, which meant, why are you laughing at me, lady? And she was horrified. She was horrified. And of course, the officers just cracked up because this poor lady had no idea that I knew something about what she was saying. That was the highlight of the day.
Did you sometimes not trust your counterparts, your Vietnamese, worrying that they might be, also at night VC?
No, I didn't have that problem. And at the district, the assistant district commander was a young lieutenant. And the actual district chief was a major who was my boss's counterpart. So I had a lot to do with the lieutenant. I never felt threatened or anything with him. I made a couple trips into Da Nang with him and did a lot of work with him and never felt like there would be a problem. But I did kid them at times and say, look, guys, on my last day here, you got to tell me, and I promise not to tell anybody else, who really are the VC. And they'd all laugh.
Yeah.
And I know there were some because a bomb went off in the district headquarters S2 shop at one point. One of their own soldiers had said it. But with the people I dealt with, no.
Did you ever talk with them about the larger state of the war? In other words, were they confident that South Vietnam could win, could hold out? Were they aware that the Americans were going to leave someday? I mean, did you ever talk at that level?
No, we never got into that. It was, at a district level. And then when I moved up at the province, it was at a province level going out on operations and with refugees and people, but we never got into that kind of thing.
What was coming home like after your year in Vietnam?
I had R&R at Christmas time. Sue, being a teacher, had Christmas off and met me in Hawaii. That was after 9 months. So I only had 3 more months. And at that point, I was at the province headquarters, which had running water and toilets and showers and everything. So it was a very different experience of being out in dialogue. When I left and came home, I was glad the year was over, but I also felt like I had accomplished something. I do remember flying in the Air Force Base out in California. We got in at night and seeing the American flag there. And that really gave me a thrill. It really did. I don't know. It was just something about it, even though we had American flags in
Yeah.
Vietnam. It was just something about being home and seeing it and then flying from there into Massachusetts to meet Sue.
Can I
Go
ask?
ahead.
Can I ask you, were you following the news? I'll ask the same question I asked Ben. Were you following the news in March, April 1975, as you saw that, that your counterparts, your allies in South Vietnam were losing this war?
Yeah, I was. I still had a reserve commission. My regular Army commission was over, but they put me in the inactive reserves, and I stayed in that for a number of years. So I was following it, and of course I had many of our friends from Germany had gone to Vietnam, so it was something that it was of interest to me, as well as the way we were handling it, which was pretty bad. So I was following the news and got more and more horrified as I saw what happened.
Tell me about April 30th, 1975, when you saw the news that the war was over.
Uh, I was um, I was working in mass transit management at that time in Philadelphia, buses, trolleys, subways. And that particular day, I was in my office, which was only 2 miles from my house, and somebody walked in and told me Saigon had fell, and I was just thunderstruck that it had all happened that fast. Ben alluded to that, of how fast everything crumbled. And of course, so much of it went back to the fact that uh, Congress and others just didn't want us to go back in and bail them out,
Yeah.
even though we had promised that in the Accords. And the fact that North Vietnam had broken the Accords by leaving troops, all of that just boded ill. And it just suddenly unraveled and struck me. And I went to my boss, who was a World War II officer, and I said to him, Henry, I just heard the news and I can't function today, which was very unusual for me. And I said, I need to go home. And he said, go, Joe, go. And so I went home, and Sue hadn't gone back teaching at that point. And I walked in and she said, what's wrong? Because she hadn't heard the news. And when I told her, I just hugged her and said, what was it all for? And that's the way I felt at the moment. What was it all for? What so many men and women had sacrificed on both the Vietnamese side and the American side.
And I think
One of
that's
your articles today that you put out was excellent, written by a Vietnamese, about the fact that Vietnam today will never heal until they accept back all the South Vietnamese. Our best man in Germany married a Vietnamese woman when he was in SOG in Vietnam, and took her home when his 18 months was over. He had extended. Um, Her family, two of her brothers, one went to a camp for 12 or 14 years. The other went underground because he had worked with the Americans on the Phoenix program and some other stuff. He went underground for the rest of his life until he died. And a number of their family, they got out using gold. And one of their nephews got out as boat people and were raided by pirates and became very successful, as so many Vietnamese have. Became very successful.
yeah, and
But it's a tragedy that today, I'm not saying we're wrong with our relations with Vietnam, but until they accept the South Vietnamese people, it's never going to heal.
right, right.
As you well know, I think from one of your write-ups once, there's always been, and in your book that you did, there's always been this North Vietnam, South Vietnam rivalry. And the North doesn't care a whole lot about South Vietnamese people, and they're the ones that are in charge. So,
Did you have a feeling of deja vu in August 2021 when you saw the news that Kabul was falling?
oh yeah, worse than that. Our two boys went into the military without my prodding them after college. The one went in and enlisted as a tanker, stayed in 4 years, Bosnia. The other went in as an engineer officer out of ROTC and made a career of 26 years, lieutenant colonel. He had two tours in Afghanistan. And when that whole fiasco and cabal, I called him up and said, "How are you doing?" Because as an engineer officer, he worked with a lot of Afghans. He was as distraught that day as I was on April 30th, and he still is.
And he's still
So
there.
it's a generational thing of both of us feeling the same way that we let a lot of people down.
Oh boy. Joe, thank you so much for coming on and just sharing this little story with us. I think that reveals so much.
Well, thank you for having the opportunity.
I hope you'll stay on for questions, because I think people will. We do want to invite people to ask questions and also to share their other stories. But before we do, I do want to get to Jim Roberts, who, like Joe, Jim was an advisor to South Vietnamese soldiers, not the South Vietnamese Army, but the regional and popular forces. Glenn, do we have? I know.
Just unmuted him.
Oh, Jim, how are you?
Good. How are you today?
Good. Why do you sound different?
I've got a bug or a cold.
You
So
sound you kind of sound better with the cold, Jim.
thank you. I'll take that as a compliment, Todd.
Not that you sound bad normally, but yeah, boy, it's like talking to a different person. Jim, first of all, I'm going to show your picture here and then just point out that this is not a regulation mustache.
That's probably the only time the colonel talked to me is when he was chewing me out. So
Okay. You were, and here's another picture of you in Vietnam. And you know, you have expressed in your stories in our magazine some of the similar feelings and perspectives that Joe shared, because for you, the war was intertwined with your relationships with Vietnamese.
yeah, Joe, it's good to meet you. I know very few people who served out in the district. So I was on a MAT team. And we were co-located with a four-man district team. We had PF platoons and a couple RF companies. By the time I got there in '71, the PFs had been given M16s and some magazines and a few bullets. They were still had a lot of lack of training. The RF company I had was a good company until it was the drawdown of the war and everyone was going home. And so eventually, yeah, the gentleman with the blue scarf was my counterpart, Captain Key. It's the soldier on the left is L.J. Turner. He was the NCO I operated with, and then that's the XO next to me, whose name I can't recall.
Okay.
And so it was during drawdown, and everyone was going home, and so eventually I was the only one left on the five-man MAT team, and they started sending me around to other units, and I was realizing just how good the company I worked with for the first 5 months I was there was, because these other units were pretty shaky. But I wrote this in the article, and I mentioned it this past Wednesday that I would have tea from time to time if we weren't in the field with my counterpart, Captain Key, and we would help each other with English. I went to the MATA course also at Fort Bragg, and then I went to DLI at Fort Bliss for 3 months for Vietnamese. And so he would help me with my Vietnamese, and I would help him with his English. I could understand things, but my pronunciation was pretty bad. And we talked just about things, and he'd been fighting the war for 10 years. His parents fled the North. And he told me that he, as well as everyone around, knew that someday the Americans would go home. And it was a day they were dreading. And he also said that he knew that if the South lost the war, he and his family would pay a horrible price. And you know, we talked about, you know, the people playing both sides of the coin. They'd pay taxes to the Vietnamese government in the daytime and pay VAT taxes at night because they didn't know who was going to win the war, but they had to live there. And I was in 3 Corps in Phu Quoc province on the border, north of Saigon. And in fact, Phu Quoc fell very quickly because the Ho Chi Minh Trail was just over the border, and we had a major offshoot called the Jolly Trail. And so they just rolled right through that, and they wiped out Song Bay, and then they got to Dong Xuai. So unlike most Americans, and like you, Joe, I got to know the Vietnamese as people. I went through basic training in AIT, and they pretty much dehumanized the Viet Cong. He's Charlie. He's Viet Cong. He's going to eat your lunch.
Yeah.
He knows where you sleep, so you know he can get there and he can get there in the dark. And so that's an attitude a lot of Americans went into the field with. But I got to know them, and when we were in the field, it was just me and Sergeant Turner. So I was completely under their control, and I needed them. So I got to know them as people. And what I saw, I didn't see the footage until the news that night because I was working, I was teaching then. But the pictures were disturbing. But what I found the most disturbing and what I still think about and is the price the people who work for Americans, what they paid. I mean, if you did anything for Americans, you were marked, and there was no way you could hide. There was no way we could bring all those people out. There weren't enough airplanes in time to bring all those people out. And in Afghanistan, it was worse because in Vietnam, American soldiers drove the fuel trucks. In Afghanistan, they hired locals.
Mhm.
It was one way. It was one way to reduce the number of overall soldiers you needed, and so all those people were marked. And so my thoughts were just the price they were going to pay, and that's something that still bothers me because I don't know the fate of my captain. I don't know the fate of my interpreter. I have no idea what happened. I just know that they overran the camp.
Jim, you tell your story beautifully and very smartly in this book, Mat 111, Dong Xuai, Vietnam, 1971. Betsy mentioned that here in the chat. It is available for sale at the veteransbreakfastclub.org shop. And Jim has very generously donated, and has donated the proceeds to the book to the Veterans Breakfast Club. And we're really grateful for that, Jim.
Well, thank you.
Um, what do you remember of April 30th, 1975?
It's fuzzy. I remember just feeling sick about the people that were there that work with Americans. That just a sick feeling that these people are paying that price. And that's how I felt when Afghanistan fell. I mean, I know there's a lot negatively said about how the withdrawal was planned for both places, but in all honesty, given the involvement, I don't know how you can tactically withdraw without having chaos
Mhm.
because the people know you're going home and they know there isn't a seat for them on the airplane. And
Mhm.
so I don't care what you do or how you plan it, it's going to be chaos when you finally pull out.
Right.
You might pull out better, but I don't think you're going to avoid the chaos. And so I just remember just having this feeling about all these people that helped us, the people that allowed me to come home, they kept me alive, and the price they paid. It's interesting. I moved from public education to the university, to Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh, and I actually had as a student one time a young man who came out on a boat. I knew we talked over the 4 years he was there, and I'm not in touch with him, but for him, he was very young, but he remembered the traumatic experience of getting out on a boat.
And I should let people know about 1 million people got out on a boat and came to this country eventually. About 1 million Vietnamese Americans, about 1 million Vietnamese immigrated to the United States, made new lives here. I also want to share that it's beyond sad. It's horrific, horrific fact that hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese died in boats. Hundreds of thousands after the fall of Saigon during the fall, 1975. Hundreds of thousands took off in rickety sampans and fishing boats, and many of them reached U.S. Navy fleets out there in the South China Sea, but some of them didn't. One person on our program who was on one of those boats is with us, Lynn. Lynn Nguyen. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Todd, how are you? And everybody, hello. Thank you for everyone for sharing their story.
Lynn was a little baby in 1975, and I think you got on one of those fishing boats, so you don't remember it, but you certainly have, the story has been told to you many, many times, I'm sure, as you were growing up. You came out on one of those boats on, was it April 25th, 1975?
My mom said it was a week before Saigon actually fell.
A
Yeah.
week, and you were picked up by a Navy ship.
Yes, I'm not exactly sure which one. Mom said it had fighter airplanes on it, so it was one of the bigger ones, the carriers or whatever they
So it
call
was
them.
a carrier. So it was a carrier in the South China Sea. And I remember you telling, I think you told me that your mom said something like, I didn't speak English. I had a bunch of kids to look after. I wasn't paying attention to the ship name,
Yeah, right.
when we were brought ashore. But this is a trauma, you as a member of the Vietnamese American community, which is large here in Pittsburgh, about 10,000, I think Vietnamese Americans live, but there are, millions across the United States. And this is a grim anniversary, I think, in the Vietnamese American community. Is it something that Vietnamese Americans recall, remember, commemorate every
Un-
year?
Unfortunately, since we were here in Pittsburgh, mom kind of disconnected from like the Vietnamese community because um, her priority was getting us acclimated or socialized into the American culture. So she told us to, learn English. This is your land now. This is America is your home.
Yeah.
So we kind of, we knew failure wasn't an option. So we had to do our school. And again, because of the bilingual thing, I have two older sisters. They brought English home. So it was easier for me by the time, well, I had to go to speech class for many years because I couldn't do the double consonants like the English language have. I was at home mostly I was speaking with my mom and dad, so I had the thick Vietnamese accent before when I went to kindergarten. So I remember going to speech class and doing the double consonants, and I couldn't say I couldn't say the sh's and the c, all those letters. But for years I had to do that, and I'm like, why do I have to get these special classes? But it was one of those things. I knew I was different off the bat growing up in Brookline in Pittsburgh, which is city, mainly Polish, Italian, working class families, just like we are. And, it was just that whole transition where I was split between, well, I guess combined two cultures, which, predominantly at home, we were the Vietnamese families, Jao and like I tell my kids, respectively, when we go to school, we had to, "Till ba ma gon đi học, till ba ma gon về học," and greet my parents and mom like we did back in Vietnam. But we also had the American side where I had to, learn, and I did a lot of observation and learning from my American friends and my American grandparents, and it was just, I don't know, that transition child where it's, there's the American, and very grateful. Like I said in my stories, when we went to Heinz Field, we were at Heinz History Center 2 years ago. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the soldiers, all the soldiers that sacrificed, because of our trials of, or the whole story of us coming here to the United States. So it's bittersweet. Like, how would I have been alive, let alone thrive here in the United States? Because my grandfather on my mom's side, he was South Vietnamese. He was Congress, like he was government. So he was, in the camps because he didn't come over here until 85 or something like that. So, there was a lot of, like a lot of questions like what if, but grateful, thankfully I am here and our family made it. It's one of the few. I mean, there's thousands of stories, I'm sure, but you hear about some of the other stories where children have lost their parents, and my mom and dad don't talk about it because I'm sure it was a very, very hard time for them. But she said
Oh,
sometimes at night she can't sleep because she's when they were fleeing, she's seen babies, next to their dead moms and dads, or
yes,
what, family members and everything. And a lot of those horrors I think she kind of block, but
totally.
she won't talk about.
Lynn, I would venture to say that your parents shared this much with you. I mean,
Very much, yeah.
there's a mountain beneath the stories that they've shared of very disturbing, horrific truths about their escape. And I should let people know that your father, Knox, served in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam for 5 years. He was an officer. Your mom convinced him to leave. He comes to this country with nothing, raises 8 children here in the United States. And I mean, it's just one of the inspiring things about being around your family and other Vietnamese Americans is you're kind of living proof of the American dream in many ways, as difficult as that transition, is or was. George Kniss, I know you have your hand raised, and I know what you're going to say. You put it here in the chat. George met you at the Heinz History Center on March 29th, Vietnam Veterans
Yes.
Day, and he's trying to convince you to write your story down. And I would echo that you need, your parents' story, your family story should be preserved.
Yes. Um, I I'm doing a lot of, now being older and understanding, you don't want to lose that.
Yeah,
I think I'm coming up here to talk, honey.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Hey,
Yeah.
David, you raised your hand and I unmuted you. Did you have a question?
No, I have something to add to the story here if I get a chance to. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, hold on. We will get to the other stories, absolutely. I just want to finish up here with Lynn and say, how much is your daughter? I know that you have at least one daughter who's in high school. How much does she know about your family story?
Not as much as I do, obviously, but I'm starting to get her to understand. And like it's we a couple weeks ago we did go to back to Fort Indian Gap to see where we first came here to the United States. I guess my first home, which was very nice. Barb accompanied me. Barb Smith. She's here
Barb
on the
Smith, who is on. I can't believe
yes,
that she accompanied you. That is so cool.
yes. She met me out there, and she told the stories to the one gift manager, and she welcomed me in and said that welcome home, and it was just mixed feelings altogether. Just to be my first American home was that camp, and and it was just very interesting. And Mom just said that she remembers a few things.
So just to reiterate, just let people know, your family, you were picked up by a carrier in the South China Sea, taken to a series of refugee camps in Guam, I think maybe the Philippines, maybe Camp Pendleton,
No, we
California.
take
No?
straight to Indian Gap.
Okay, so you went to Fort Indiantown Gap, which is in central Pennsylvania, and
Yes,
it was there that you started your American life.
correct.
And you had not been to Fort Indiantown Gap since that time.
Now,
And so you went recently back to Fort Indiantown Gap, and the wonderful Barb Smith, who just met you right at the Heinz History Center
yes.
on March 29th, volunteered to accompany you there. Barb, can you tell us what that was like?
It was fabulous. This is the curator of the museum, Charlie Olick, at the Fort Indiantown Gap, and he was so gracious to get books out for Lynn to look at that had daily newspapers in Vietnamese, written also in Cambodian. It was so fabulous to meet her children. It was 22 days after the Vietnam Heinz Center celebration. So thank you again to VBC again. But it was so great to see her and her teaching her children about her experience. Everybody was so happy to meet her. It was such a special time for my husband and me, for sure. Thank you, Lynn.
Yeah,
Well,
no, thank you, Barb.
Write that book.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, write
Slowly.
that book. Write that book. And Barb, what a special thing for you to do for Lynn and her family. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you, Lynn, for joining us. And again, I do want to encourage people to ask questions before we move on to general, conversation. I see John Kramer's with us, whose story is here in the magazine, his memory. I want to go to Jay Veith because Jay's
Well,
the expert here. And Lynn, I think you might be interested. I mean, here's a man, Jay Veith, an Army veteran who is a PhD historian,
mm,
who probably knows more about the country you were born in than you do
mm.
Right?
because he studied it, and he's one of the few Americans who has studied it. Hello, Jay.
How you doing?
Your book, you're an author of several books about the history of Vietnam, one of them being Black April, the Fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975. You've listened so far for an hour. You're very generous with your time to these remembrances of the fall of South Vietnam. What do you think, as the expert, as a historian, what do you think we Americans should know about the Republic of Vietnam, the country that we pledged to save?
Well, I think the first thing and most important thing is to recognize that it was a country that was trying to build itself and fight a war at the same time, which is almost impossible nowadays. And unfortunately, what we call a trope in the historian business of South Vietnam is this corrupt, incompetent, cowardly country simply does not hold up when you start examining it very quickly. Now, listen, the South Vietnamese military, like any military, had good units that had bad units that went up and down in time and over certain areas of the country. But I've always said that you have to balance any of the negative things you're going to say about the particular South Vietnamese unit with a unit that stood and fought in different times. So that's the thing I think most people who are still sort of infected with the left-wing view of South Vietnam and the American role in it don't want to realize and don't really realize.
So yeah, and your work has been cited as important scholarship that, as we say, rehabilitates, in a sense, Arvind's reputation. I mean, I spent years teaching a course on the history of Vietnam, and yeah, absolutely, as a, taking an orthodox approach to the war, I would denigrate Arvind. And since then, I've learned, Arvind was big. I mean, it was one of the largest armies in the world at the time, and you had excellent elite wonderful units. You had, draftees who didn't want to be there. And like any other institution, there was good and bad. Would you say, however, that it would have been possible for the U.S. to have stemmed the offensive in March and April 1975 by intervening?
Well, you have to remember something, that the U.S. government was prohibited by law by Congress in August of 73 of any sort of military action whatsoever in Indochina, air, sea, whatever. So they were prohibited by law from re-intervening. Now, having said that, by April, and one of the most impressive logistics feats of the world in the war, the North Vietnamese formed this massive, what they called coastal column, 2,000 vehicles of just barreling south down Route 1, which would have been a prime target for naval gunfire and or air power. And then on Ho Chi Minh Trail, they were the same thing. They were just backed up in column after column, raising huge dust clouds. So this, what we call in the military, a target-rich environment had appeared for the first time in the war, because they were sending basically their entire military south to surround Saigon and take it as fast as they possibly could.
So Jay, it's almost as if it's almost as if finally in March, April 1975, the U.S. got what it had wanted the whole war. That is a large set-piece conventional confrontation with the North Vietnamese army. I mean, one of the problems of fighting an asymmetrical war is you can't find the enemy. It's ambush, hit and run, guerrilla tactics. But when the enemy starts fighting in a conventional way, then you could bring your superior firepower to bear and succeed. So, target-rich environment. If the U.S. had, if the U.S. had decided to intervene, and it would have been successful.
Well, I can't say it would have been successful, because that would require the South Vietnamese to have formed a defense. You have to remember 72 offensive, which was basically stopped not just with U.S. air power, but because the army, had basically found time and space to stiffen. So you needed both elements. You needed a guy in the ground pointing a gun, and you needed air power to help them. So the South Vietnamese basically had lost the upper two regions and almost all the units in there. So trying to form a defensive line would have been very difficult. But yes, we could have basically wiped out the People's Army coming south.
Okay.
Easily.
All right. And this is beyond your mandate here, Jay. And I know that, but you know what I'm going to ask next. Should the U.S. have intervened?
Well, you're now entering what's called a counterfactual. In my personal opinion, is yes.
Okay.
Because we had, why, if you're not going to go in and win, why go in? Look at all the Americans who've just been on here, their sacrifices, the 60,000 American dead, several hundred thousand wounded, not to mention the several hundred thousand South Vietnamese, and people often forget about the Cambodians and Laos who fought too. So,
yeah.
But if you have a second, I would like to tell a couple stories about the last days at Tons of Note, which might curl Mr. Wright's hair, which he may not be aware of. And some of these things, because I spent years gathering, and people don't know this, but the communists have published extensively, and I mean extensively, on the war, and rightfully they're very proud of their victory. So a couple of things that he probably wasn't aware of. So the first thing was that the North Vietnamese had wrestled this SAM-2 anti-aircraft missile battery all the way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to not right outside, but nearby the airport. They got all the vans in place. They got all the missiles locked up. They flipped the radars on, and they're seeing all this traffic over Tan Son Nhut. And this is the morning of the 28th, and they asked permission to fire. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if they had fired and shot down one of our planes? That's, that would have been that would have put the U.S. government in a very difficult position. But what happened, and this is extremely rare if you read People's Army histories. So they flipped the radars on, they asked permission to fire, and the book then says, and the deputy commander of the air defense branch was actually in the radar van, and he said no. And the book goes on to say, if it was not for the cowardly actions of the air defense commander,
Oh my
we
God.
would have won a great victory. And trust me when I say you very rarely see stuff like that in North Vietnamese histories. The other thing that might get your reader's attention is, so the North Vietnamese launched a 5-prong offensive against Saigon, and one of the prongs was the 10th Division, which basically was designed to come straight down Route 1. Well, they had learned how to fight in what's called combined arms operation. They had learned their lessons from '72. So now they're moving with sappers ahead of time. They had anti-aircraft, they had engineers, infantry riding with their tanks. Well, they actually formed 2 columns. The main one coming down Route 1, and then they sent one kind of looping around to the north of Tan Son Nhut. And the one coming down Route 1 kind of ran into some stiff ARVN resistance. Well, the one that was coming around the north just bypassed everybody, had no resistance. And on the early morning of the 28th, that tank column was right outside the Tan Son Nhut gate. And the lead T-54 tries to cross, he's on this little road, and there's a bridge crossing the stream, and I'm an old tanker, and he goes across the bridge, and the bridge is too weak, and it collapses the tank and the bridge into the thing. So the whole column was right outside the gate on the morning of the 28th, had to back up and go all the way back around to Route 1 and join the other column. And then the last 2 things I'll share was the A-37 airstrike was actually led by a former Vietnamese Air Force pilot who had been a secret communist agent for 10 years. He had bombed the palace, defected, and then went to Phan Rang, got the A-37s, trained these guys, and led the strike. And then the actual artillery bombardment was from the other side of Saigon. They were actually firing over deliberately. And then the last thing I'll share was one of the last planes shot down was on the afternoon of the 28th with a Vietnamese Air Force AC-119 gunship that was trying to support the troops that were still fighting, and an SA-7 took it out. You can see the plane coming, just spiral down. So there was a lot of things that happened outside Tan Son Nhut that most Americans are completely unaware of.
And people could read about some of these things in your book. You've had several books about Vietnam. One of them, I think, and the one that focuses most on the fall of Saigon, is Black April, the fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975. Could you, Jay, if you wouldn't mind, put a link to the book here in the chat so that people could order it if they'd like? I think they'd love to read more.
Absolutely, I'll do that when we move on to questions.
Okay, and we are moving on to questions. After I want David. David, I don't recognize you. Have you joined us before?
Have not.
Oh, you have not. Okay, so tell us a little bit. Are you a veteran?
I am.
And when did you serve in Vietnam?
I arrived in Vietnam in 1971 at Phuket Air Base. Security policeman, which had nothing to do with what we were doing in Vietnam. It was called base defense.
Okay.
So I went to the Army School I learned how to fire a mortar, drive a 113 tank, the armored personnel carrier. And that was my life there, okay, at Phuket, which was in the Central Highlands on the coastal plain, if you know where Quy Nhon is.
Mm-hmm.
It was about 10 miles to the northeast. Now it's an airport for Quy Nhon, but anyways, that's where I started in May of 71. After that point, we turned the base over to the South Vietnamese, and the major that was our squadron commander said, "Where do you want to go?" He says, "Da Nang or Saigon?" I said, "Well, I heard Saigon was good." So off I went to Saigon. I hated my first 2 months in Saigon in the Air Force. I did the town patrol, I did black marketing. It was not like what I was doing at Phuket. And I said, what's going on here? Anyways, my boss knew that I wasn't liking things. And he said, they're interviewing somebody for the U.S. Embassy. "Oh, would you be interested?" I said, "Yeah, well, okay, sure." So off I went to the interview, and I did the interview, and there was a 12-person security police detachment at the U.S. Embassy. And we got to wear civilian clothes. We had our own room with a bathroom, air conditioned, in downtown Saigon, long way from Phuket. Okay. And I'm saying, life is good. So what I didn't know is we were working for the Central Intelligence Agency at that point, in uniform, but we didn't have to wear a uniform. So we had our own vehicle, our own room. Life was good. Life was super good. And then March of 73, when the military pulled out, I only had about 3 or 4 months left of my enlistment. So I ended up staying there. I got a civilian job there, and basically doing the same thing, but at a higher level as a security officer in the CIA. I had a Vietnamese major working in my office. I had 5 sergeants from the National Police. And our main job was mainly taking care of the security in Saigon and Gia Dinh province around it. But I got to do other things with the agency. But that was the job until 1975. I was still there. And I wrote an article, but I remember in 75 when Phuc Long fell, that I said, that's pretty close to Saigon. I know the area pretty well. I got to know Vietnam pretty well in those years, in the military as well as the civilian time. But on my birthday, March 10th, 1975, I turned 25, and that's when Me Thuot fell.
Yeah.
And I knew things were not good. In fact, 2 weeks after Me Thuot fell, Da Nang fell. A friend of mine, a very good personal friend of mine at the agency, was up in Da Nang trying to get people out and do things. And when he came back to Saigon, he said, "Get the blank out of this country. You don't know what I saw in Da Nang." So I could only think what was going on. But we had a choice. They did ask us, do we want to stay? Yeah, I wanted to stay. I wanted to be, I don't know if it was not part of history, but I spent so much time there and I had so many friends and relationships in Saigon that I didn't want to leave. I said, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And I was there until the 29th. And I'm currently writing a book. No embellishments. It's my story. And I could tell you, at the Operation Baby Lift, I went out to the crash site, picked up, the casualties there. So I was part of that operation. But I want to mention something really quickly. The American community was so small back then. You had 400 and something people at the DAO, Defense Attaché Office, former MACV, and the embassy. But everybody kind of pitched in. They were at the hospital. I was out at the crash scene. I came to the hospital. But I had a very much of a relationship with the orphanage at the Air Force apartment house in Saigon. Was right next door. So most of those children, the orphans on the plane, I knew. We went over there one day, and we just started to get really close to these people. So the next thing I knew was April 1975, where I seen Christine at the evacuation center, and I said, "Oh God, thank God, these kids are finally getting a chance on life." And 2 hours later, I get a call on my radio. I'm back to the embassy that there's an inbound emergency on the C-5 aircraft, and they crashed about a mile and a half. It's still a very emotional moment for me, going out to the crash site. And at the time, they had these babies in boxes, like a case of beer box. Most of them were there, and either was moving or not. But anyways, the American community there at that time was, so, like I said before, was so small but everybody, offices emptied out, and there was people doing things that was normally not their part of their job description, okay, above and beyond the call of duty as civilians, okay. And I give a shout out to the Seventh Adventist Hospital, which took over after the Third Field Hospital there in Saigon. Those people were just great, okay. So yeah, so those I'm going through an emotional moment. You can see that, but and then in the end, it happened very quickly. It was very scary because we only had that Marine detachment at the embassy, which was about 30 or 35 people. And then you had the Defense Attaché office, which really had no internal security at that point. But I had the CIA security in town was pretty much intact. We had almost 500 Nun guards taking care of our residences in place, and they were loyal. They were very loyal people up to the end. And so people ask me a question. I said we probably had the last organized on the last day in Vietnam. We had the last organized protection group. Okay, we're waiting to hear from you. We trust you, that sort of thing. So the last days were tough, and yeah, the last day happened so very quickly. If you take a fast forward moving film and just put it on high speed, that's the way it happened. Okay, I had time to digest it once I got from the helicopter, from the hotel. We picked up some people at other evacuation high buildings in Saigon, and I drove out to the docks, and that was the last time I drove in town. I would not go out there again. I was told to go out there, and not good. South Vietnamese soldiers were firing on you, okay? So you were either the savior or the enemy the last day. And that was a very strange position to be in.
David, I'm so grateful that you joined us and shared what you shared with us. Please do email me if you could, Todd, Todd, at veteransbreakfastclub.org.
I will.
I don't want to lose contact with you.
But I want to hear some other people's questions if they have it.
I know, and they will have questions. I also want to send this to you. Every Vietnam veteran, I'm trying to get this in the hands of every Vietnam veteran I know. 64-page book, History of Vietnam and the Vietnam War. It's a good book, I know, because I wrote it. And it's something that I'm eager to get feedback from Vietnam veterans about it. So I want to put one in the mail to you. So if you could please contact me. I'm curious to hear about your book in the works also.
Yes, so that's going along. And I'm sorry for being so late to this organization, because I think it's so great for what you're doing. Because there are stories, and I have a poem from this Vietnamese citizen, and he says he doesn't want the stories to be like tears in the rain. And that's exactly that's what exactly that poem kind of made me write, okay? Because it's not just my story. It's everyone's story.
You bet. You bet. That's it. That's why it's not just your story. Your story speaks for a lot of people who didn't get to write theirs. We have one member. We have some hands up here. Another one of my heroes is with us tonight, Sister Mary Nell. Sister Mary Nell, you were a member of that small American community that Dave mentioned in Vietnam, helping orphans and others get out. You recently went back, right, with a group of
Yes, we've just been back. Tomorrow it will be 2 weeks, and we had a wonderful experience. And I really hope that I can be in touch with David to get a copy of his book, because so many of the orphans who were in our nurseries, as well as in orphanages and in child care facilities throughout South Vietnam, are most interested in knowing everything they can find out about their history. Our nursery was one of the ones loaded on that C-5A. We lost 76 children in the cargo hold. 100 survived in the troop compartment, and we lost 6 volunteers who were the child care workers on in the cargo section. And so when you talk about helping to evacuate those wounded to the Seventh Day Hospital, yes, that rings so true for us. And so I'll be eager to hang on your every word about each moment of that experience, as well as March 17, when Mr. George Jacobson in the American Embassy authorized an American aircraft to fly to Phnom Penh in order to evacuate 42 Cambodian orphans who were destined for Canadian adoptive families. And so that experience really was most dramatic. And I imagine from your position there with the CIA in the American Embassy in March of 75, you probably heard something about that. So, oh, I'm grateful for this opportunity. And then in addition to our 2 weeks plus trip throughout Vietnam, then just this past Thursday and Friday, the Pan Am Museum in Long Island had an event to honor both President Ford for his declaration of Operation Baby Lift and Pan Am for their participation in lifting children from harm's way to a future of life. We used Pan Am several times every week in the 70s to transport children to adoptive parents.
Here is
Thank you.
I want to share a
Oh,
picture of
and the woman who started our program in 1967 is the woman in the center, an Australian ex-Mercy nun, Rosemary Taylor. Sister Susan Carroll is standing by her with one of the children in our nursery. We were near the corner of Van Foam and MacDinchie. And that was our nursery, and you can see some of our wonderful Vietnamese child care workers in the background who took such loving care of those children until they could be placed and flown to adoptive homes all over the world. We were placing children throughout Europe, Germany, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, England, and also in Australia and in Canada, as well as throughout the US.
and that is you, Sister Mary Nell, on the far left, and you've changed
That's
very
it.
little. That's it.
That's it.
That's right. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad that you did. I want to get to Bob Oles, who I got to meet and get to know much better in New Orleans. Bob, how are you? I'm going to ask you to unmute if you can. There you are.
I'm doing very well, Todd. How is everyone?
Good.
I just wanted to quickly, first of all, those stories are just fantastic. I just want to acknowledge 2 Marines that I had the pleasure to serve with. One was Sergeant Major Terry Bennington, with whom I served in 1993 when I was on recruiting duty. Now, in April 1975, he was a young embassy Marine there at the embassy at Saigon.
Oh.
And he was among the last 11 Marines to be airlifted by the CH-46 helicopter that was flown by Major Jerry Berry, who over the last couple days flew about 18 hours straight evacuating civilians from the embassy. So that was my one link. My other link is my dear friend Steve Elliott, who was evacuated as an orphan during Operation Baby Lift. He made it to the U.S. He was subsequently adopted by a Vietnam veteran and New York City firefighter. Steve and I served in the same infantry squad in the Gulf War, and he subsequently embarked on a 34-year career with the FDNY, where he's still serving as a captain. So he's just a great example of the American dream and success story. So I just thought this was appropriate insert into those great stories.
Thank you for paying tribute. So your friend, the Marine, was he one of those Marines who were left behind? I mean, for a while they thought we were
Yes.
forgotten about, and they were gonna,
They thought that they were on their own.
yeah, right.
And Master Sergeant Valdez was the NCOIC, and he had a very close relationship with Master Sergeant Valdez, and they thought for sure that they were going to be captured.
They were absolutely prepared to fight on their
Absolutely.
own.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. What a story. Oh
Yeah.
boy. Hey, thank you, Bob. Al Smith.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone caught on CBS Sunday morning. They did a whole segment on this last day in Saigon, and they interviewed quite a few of the soldiers that were on the ground, and they did interview Valdez and a couple of the other guys, and they thought they were left there for 2 hours, and all of a sudden they see two helicopters coming to get them, and they got him out. Valdez was, I guess, the last American on a helicopter. And the other thing I thought fascinating, the ambassador didn't want to leave that day.
Right.
And finally, one, I think it was a helicopter pilot, went to him and said, "Sir, you got to get out." He says, "I'm not going." And he said, "The President of the United States demand you go." And then he said, "Okay, I'll leave." He said, "Did the president ever say that?" He said, "No way. I just told him that. That's the only way I could get him to go."
I understood. Yeah, I understood that the order was to arrest him if he wouldn't go. Hey, before I can't believe that it's almost 8:30. Time just flew.
Go on here.
I do want to talk to Ron Farina. Ron, I hope you're still with us. Glenn, if you could see
I'm looking,
Ron.
yeah, I'm looking. I saw him earlier.
I saw him earlier too. I'm afraid that he bailed on us.
Not seeing Ron.
I think Ron bailed on us.
Ron, wave your hand a lot if
Darn it. I'm going to owe him a big apology because I asked him to join us to share the story of his friend Al Rose, who was killed this day, 1967, and he sent me a very Oh, there he is. He's on. No, it's not him.
not seeing the name, Todd.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, I'll owe him an apology. I think we do have a few other hands left here in the air. Chris Perolo.
Hey, hi, Todd. I was late to the party here tonight but after hearing some of the talk here, I thought I'd chime in with I mentioned a letter that I had from my
Yes.
roommate. He flew into the middle of everything there, and he was aboard the USS Blue Ridge. I may have misspoke about some of the details here, but I found that letter finally, and I won't read the entire page here, but there's a segment here where he says, "We had grunts sleeping on the floor all over the compartment. They were from Saigon, and they were pretty impressive. They were all carrying 2 to 3 pistols, M16 or a machine gun, and sometimes a wicked-looking machine pistol. A lot of them were from the embassy, and 2 dudes I talked to were in the car that took Ambassador Martin to his chopper. He left on one of the last birds. Talked to a lot of people from the embassy, and I understand Martin really butchered the evac. Left a lot of people who should have gotten out. Also had a guy on board who hauled down the last American flag from the embassy. I think he had it in the locker next to mine. Lucky he didn't get it ripped off. I hear the grunts blew up the embassy exchange, and a couple dudes I met shot out all the embassy TVs with 357s. Heard a lot of stories like that." And that's from that was May 1st. He wrote May 1st. He's talking about the people he met on May 1st after he arrived on the Blue Ridge the day before.
So he was on the USS Blue Ridge, which received the ambassador.
Right. He says that I hear she is in the ship. I moved over to the Blue Ridge. I hear she is in the papers a lot back stateside. We had the ambassador aboard and Key. It was former President Key. I didn't see it, but there were so many choppers trying to land that they were just pushing them overboard into the ocean as fast as they could land. Pilots were jumping into the water and leaving their choppers to crash. One hit the Blue Ridge. They pushed about 15 overboard off the Enterprise. And then he tells me about the Marines he met. But that was an eyewitness account from my roommate in A school. And I found that letter after all these years.
And that's a historic letter, Chris.
Yeah. And he also talks about spending 2 days in the Philippines setting up the refugee camp not far from Clark Air Force Base before he was shipped out over there because he was in transit to the 7th Fleet at that time.
Wow.
But that's
Thank
an account.
Chris, thank you for sharing that. I know I urged you to find it if you could, and you did. And I'd love to have it, look at it, and with your permission, maybe post it on our website, because that is a historic letter. You know, before we say goodnight, I'm very glad Dave Seaver joined us, because Dave was a child during the fall of Saigon, but he was in the Air Force, an Air Force officer during the fall of Kabul. And you were on the back end of one of those evacuations, and I'm going to share pictures that you sent with me. Tell us what we're looking at here.
So I was 14 years old when Saigon fell. So not quite a child, but I guess, depending upon how you want to define that. So I was at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. And that's what you're seeing there is the flight line. Because as we all are now well aware, Afghanistan fell much more quickly than anticipated. And so it was just a mad scramble to get people out of there. Do you have the picture of the first aircraft out of there, the inside?
I do.
They did a head count on that. Somebody analyzed that picture. There were 823 people. That's one of the hangars that I had to provide medical care for.
Oh, okay.
9 facilities like that. But the first C-17 out, that's the one you see in all the newsreels rolling down the ramp.
Yeah.
That thing, it's being swarmed by, people who are just desperate to get out of the country. And you get the sanitizer. They don't tell you about the dozens of people that thing ran over and crushed. I could tell you about the guys once you see it up in the air pitching off of it. That's not as pretty as the news made it sound. Because that was the first aircraft into Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar where I was. So, the original plan was supposed to be starting July 28th. We would get one aircraft with up to 200 people on board every 6 to 8 hours. They would, if they needed medical care, we would provide it. They would be in process, immigrated into the country of Qatar, put on buses and sent down the road to Camp Saleh, which was an army facility. So one aircraft up to 200 people every 6 to 8 hours to a maximum of 5,000 people. Well, what they say about war plans go out the window when the first shot's fired. July 28th came and went. Sunday morning, August 15th, my phone rang. And it was my squadron commander, and he didn't even say hello. He just said, "We have aircraft on the way, get in here." And that first aircraft just started the deluge. After that, it was 2 weeks of 24/7 flights with 400 to 450 people on board. Sometimes, we didn't have enough room on the ground for them. The C-17s would sometimes have to circle for hours before we could clear room on the ground for them to land and deboard all these people. Sometimes to the point that we would have to send a tanker up to them to keep them up there until we could clear room on the ground. Make a long story short, the 5,000 we were never supposed to have on base turned into 58,000 Afghan refugees. So if you do the math, we pulled 123,000 people out in that 2-week airlift. 58,000 is about 47 or almost half of those people came to Al Udeid Air Base.
And it's, I believe, the largest airlift.
The largest airlift in history.
In history.
And it wasn't a military operation. It was a State Department operation. It's called a NEO, a non-combatant extraction operation. But obviously, the State Department doesn't own a lot of C-17s, so the Air Force had to get involved in more ways than one.
And here is you shared a patch.
Yeah.
Here's the patch of that operation.
So yeah, so initially, so I had that patch made and I gave it to all of my medical staff. And I also gave one to our wing commander, General Donahue. That literally describes it. I had for the first week, along with keeping the med group open to, maintain the health of the airbase personnel, I also had to start manning these facilities 24/7. And initially I had, I think, including myself, 36 bodies to do that with. And as they kept coming in, well, we're opening up this hangar now and you have to provide medical care. Okay, great. And then, I wound up, you have that warehouse picture?
Yeah. Let me see here.
Yeah, so basically 9 facilities with, thousands and thousands of people in them. Keep in mind, it's 125, 130 degrees there, and a lot of these people haven't had food or water for days when they've arrived. So we're taking them out of 90-degree Kabul into 125, 130-degree Qatar. The proudest thing I can say for all of us who were there is nobody died. All of them survived. Because I told the wing commander, I said, had one of those people died, every news organization on the planet would have been knocking down the front gate to get a picture of the body. Let me just send it to you again, Todd.
No. I got it. I found it.
Okay.
I found it.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna go to Greg Yost, and then we'll have to close the program.
Yeah.
But here it is.
No, that's one of the C-17 hangars.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's what
Yeah.
I thought you were asking for.
Yeah, no, it's the warehouse picture, the one that's like you can almost not see to the other end of it.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
so big. Yeah,
That's
that
I
one.
don't have that.
Oh, I thought you had
accessible.
that one. Okay, I'm
I think
sorry. Well,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, this is a whole nother hour and a half plus program.
Yeah, it sure
Just to
is.
get through, the 2 weeks of the airlift that occurred there and everything that went on. It was just, I was in Afghanistan in 2010 during the surge. I was there almost 7 months. And, the 3 weeks that I had to deal with this, I was probably more exhausted from that 3 weeks than I was from the 7 months in Afghanistan in 2010.
Right. Yeah, Rick Harrisman, why are we talking about Afghanistan? And I think it's because what a history more than rhymes in this instance, that there's such an echo, a strong echo from
Yeah.
the fall of Saigon. And I think the younger generation, and Dave, you count here as the younger generation, can relate to the tragedy of the fall of Saigon because of your own experience with Afghanistan.
It's like all the essay questions I got when I was in nursing school. Compare and contrast.
Right. Greg Yost, we're going to give you the last word. We're past time here.
Yes, thank you so much all for your stories. Like Todd and some of the others on here, I'm a book person, but of course, we can't tell the full story or even the real story without these types of stories. I think this is absolutely great. I would say there's something that came up, a word that ironically did not come up the entire discussion. And like I say, I'm a big picture and a book person. Between January 73 and the spring of 75, the W word hasn't been mentioned yet tonight. And that, of course, is the Watergate word, right? With the whole scandal, with the whole mistrust of government and everything like that. Nixon was president, and then Gerald Ford becomes president because of Watergate. To his credit, the U.S. was committed to defending South Vietnam should there be an invasion. And in the winter of 74, 75, I mean, Watergate had happened, the oil embargo, things just weren't going well. The U.S. knew that the North Vietnamese was preparing a major offensive in the spring. U.S. intelligence knew that this was going to come down. So in January 75, Ford went to Congress saying they're gonna be invading this spring. We're committed to supporting them. And Congress, of course, as we would all predict, said no. Now, it might have been an easy question for Ford to ask because he knew what the answer was going to be. But he did ask Congress for support for the South Vietnamese and was rejected. The U.S. knew this whole thing was coming down, and the U.S. also knew fairly early on that probably South Vietnam wasn't going to last. So that's where some of these big picture questions can be directed. But that's as we mentioned, another story. Ford did ask for help. U.S. knew it was coming. No help was provided. April 30th, 1975. Thank you all for your talks.
And thank you, Greg, and thank you all for who shared their stories tonight. And my apologies to those we didn't get to. I see we have Rob Karskadin, who's in Hanoi. He could give us the perspective from Vietnam, how the end of the war, reunification day, is celebrated in Vietnam today. That would be interesting to hear. We have Ross Meter, who was also evacuated the last day of the Fall of Saigon. We didn't hear from him. Many of our Vietnam veterans we didn't hear from. So we're going to have to figure out a way to do this again to continue the conversation. In the meantime, I do hope you have a good evening. Thank you all again for joining us. And I hope to see you Thursday night when I will be co-host and Glenn will be hosting, and we'll be talking about the end of the war in Europe, 1945. All right. See you then. Take care.